Hello, and welcome to this Dark Elf Slave Overhaul exhibition video. I am here to give an overview of this mod and explain why you should be interested in it. So, the idea for this mod came, I won a legendary Malekith domination victory, which means you get the 272 settlements conquered, campaign on turn 118. So, Dark Elves are not weak. That is, they're quite strong overall right now. They don't need more power. But it was a frustrating experience, in part because to play optimally, the slave consumption winds up scaling to a crazy degree, over 10,000, and while you can often get that much when you have 30 armies, it gets to the point where if anything ever gets set back along the way, it's very easy to dig yourself into a hole. It is basically very punishing for mistakes, and is very punishing for people who are new to Dark Elves. That's what this mod is aimed at fixing. If you are a Dark Elf veteran, the mod will mainly make it a smoother and less frustrating experience, but if you're really good at Dark Elves, you're not going to really see a power increase. So the two core ideas of this mod are, first of all, you lose 20% of slaves per turn, and that is your main slave consumption. This means that it is difficult to get to the higher slave amounts, and you need armies supported by infrastructure to do so, but your economy will also not collapse, in 2 turns if you stop fighting. It'll basically increase and decrease more gradually. It should be a smoother, less frustrating experience. The second part is that dictats are actually very useful and important to use to get optimal results. As opposed to the default game where they are effectively entirely ignorable. They are frustrating to use for minimal results, which is not really a good combination. So, now, before we go into the nitty-gritty details of this, I'm sure you're going to have some questions like, hang on a second, this idea is cool and all, but I don't want to just use a mod that's like a power trip and just makes the game easy mode, because I 100% agree with you. So I'm going to show some numbers to demonstrate why I think this mod is frankly balanced, at least in terms of balanced in the same way that the default Dark Elves are balanced. If you want to argue Dark Elves by default are too strong, then this mod will probably have them be too strong as well. But the goal is to replicate the unmodded power level, in effect. So first of all, one of the things I did, and there will be links to this down below, is I did 2 videos from turn 0 to turn 30 as Morathi on normal, and I showed the unmodded version, and then I showed the modded version. This is the modded version of that. And so if you want to see the play-by-play, how we got everywhere, you'll have an opportunity to do so. Spoiler that they wind up basically being identical. There's 1 extra city captured in the modded game. Ironically, this one right here, Hag Hall. It is under siege and about to be captured on turn 31 in the unmodded game. And other than that, the settlement count is exactly the same, and the income is pretty close as well. So, let's talk about some details there rather than just taking my word for it. So first of all, you can see this is the modded game, and you see right now we are making 21,620 gold on turn 30. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. Okay, now we're in the unmodded game. You can see the lack of the 20% decline mentioned in the slaves, and we are now making 22,120, which I believe is about technically 500 gold more per turn. But that's pretty close. Okay, so now let's take a look at another example. Alright, here we are in the unmodded version of the game. You'll notice we actually have about 1,000 more slaves right now, and there's no 20% decline indicated. And here Hag Hall is about to fall. We are making a total of 19,271 gold. Again, having that extra settlement is a big deal in terms of the small difference indicated there. So now let's flip this over to unmodded and see what's going on. Or modded, sorry. And here we are in the unmodded campaign with the mod turned on. The mod is designed to be seamlessly integratable into a saved game. You can just literally take your saved game, load the mod into it, and keep playing, or you can remove it. It won't have... It'll change how it plays, but it's compatible either way. So, we are now making 19,019 gold, which is a slight decrease. So you may have noticed in both of these cases, the unmodded version has an actually higher, slightly base gold compared to unmodded given the same file. Yes, the modded campaign, the one that was run with the mod from turn 0, wound up having a bit more raw gold, but that's partly because we wound up getting Hag Hall, and there's campaign fluctuations. Things played out slightly differently despite my best efforts. There's going to be some randomness involved there. But, in both cases we have the exact same number of settlements, with the exception of Hag Hall. Again, if you want to see the details on how everything went, you can look at the videos, but I think this is pretty close. And it also illustrates a point, like, why is the income higher on the modded version? And the answer is that the dictats were used effectively to grow a bit faster. However, basically, once things grow, the unmodded version will catch right back up and is in fact ahead at the start. So there's a little bit of leapfrogging, as one is better at the start, the other is slightly better, than the other slightly better. I can't get it exactly the same throughout the whole game, but I think it's within a few percent for basically all of the game, sometimes favoring one, sometimes favoring the other. So for our next example along those lines, we're going to jump to a Malekith turn 81 short victory. And here we are on turn 81, where we have a short victory, I believe, was just obtained. This is a game played with the mod from turn 1. So you see it's turn 81, we've conquered Ulthuan, we are expanding into Norsca and the like, and our total income at this point, as you can see, is 179,948. Now this is the modded version, which means that right now we're in the 5,000 to 20,000 slave threshold, more on that in a little bit, so we're currently getting a 45% income from buildings bonus, and that'll be very relevant because in the unmodded version of the save, we are making 196,430, which is more. And as mentioned, this is because we are not at the highest tier of slave bonuses in the modded campaign yet. Basically, the base values unmodded are higher, and you need to hit the slave thresholds in the modded campaign to keep up with the unmodded power. So it's important to expand your territory, build your infrastructure, get more armies to keep up with the decline. So as you can see, different points of the game, one is slightly better than the other. So I'm going to show two more examples here. The next one is a Rakarth campaign at turn 124, which was started as modded, and then I'll show the modded versus unmodded. So here's the modded version of the Rakarth campaign, which again was played from turn 0, or turn 1 as modded. We just managed to win the ultimate campaign victory, where we stopped the Dawi Tide. We were 24 settlements short of domination campaign victory, and we are currently making 431,116 gold. And here is the unmodded version of it. We're making 410,117. So that is like, what, 4% less, I think? But the main reason for that is that some of the baseline technologies are just super weak when it comes to income, and they give like 1% or less bonus income for researching them. And in this mod, they're more like 2%. And so you take, that 1% difference 4 times, and voila, there's your difference. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so you've shown that these are very, very close, within a few percent generally. But what about if you played a campaign unmodded from start that went past turn 30? Excellent question. We're about to show the last example. And here we are with the unmodded campaign that started us down this whole chain of events to create the mod. It is turn 118. We have just won the domination campaign victory with 272 settlements. The few turns ago, the Black Pyramid event triggered, and we have armies en route, but we weren't able to reach it before we conquered enough stuff to win domination victory anyway. We're currently making 414,236 gold. We are losing over 10,000 slaves a turn, and we have 34 armies plus black arcs. And here is that same campaign that was played unmodded, but with the mod enabled. You see that we are making 449,878 gold. Now you might be thinking, hang on, that's more like an 8% difference. What's up with that? Well, number one, as mentioned, there's a few things that individually are like maybe a % difference, but at this late in the campaign, we've managed to accumulate enough of them, which is why the Rakarth one was like 4%. But you're like, okay, that only explains part of it. What is the rest? And that comes down to really a single reason here. Malekith's Tyrant Tree starts with 5% building income and 1 control all provinces. Now, by default, this motivation through fear is 5% slave income. That is weaker than 5% income from all buildings, let alone 1 control in that. So basically, this talent by default is like a third of the strength of this talent, maybe less, maybe like a quarter of the strength. It's really bad. Like, you just skip this. It is horrible. Now, we took the philosophy of, okay, this is splitting it in half, 1 control and 5% income, so this one is now 10% income, right? So this and this is supposed to be the same power. So that is effectively the other few percent that makes up the difference. So ultimately, it's pretty close. I am still completely open to tweaking some stuff, and based upon feedback. But making the talent go from being effectively worthless, don't even bother getting it, to, okay, it's actually meaningful now as one of Malekith's premier talents, I don't regret that. So, let's take a look at some of the nitty-gritty details now that we've established that it's pretty much within a few percent of income throughout the game. This is not going to put you into God mode or anything, and as you can see from the 2 turn 30 tests exactly how that plays out and just how similar and close they are. Alright, time to go down the main feature list now. So, first of all, the core slave loss in this, rather than being consumed by industry buildings and ports, is just losing 20% of slaves per turn, period. This means that basically it's still difficult to have a huge amount of slaves as normal, but it's a lot more forgiving if things go wrong, whether your faction is halted by Tzeentch, or you lose some battles, or you're just newer to Dark Elves and not being as aggressive as you quote-unquote should be. It's designed to be a more forgiving experience. Along with that, because of that 20% slave threshold, the loss, the slave thresholds have been changed from 800, 2,000, 5,000, and 10,000. They are now 300, 1,200, 5,000, and 20,000. So it's basically a factor of 4 each time. So let's talk about the next thing, industry buildings. As you can see, they still have their base income, but they no longer generate additional income from slaves, and they no longer drain slaves either. Now, because they no longer generate additional income from slaves, you can now get those bonuses from having a high slave population. You'll see that the income from buildings is plus 30% at this point. By default, that's plus 10%. So by default, I believe it goes 5, 10, 15, and 20% for income from all buildings. In the mod, it goes 15, 30, 45, and 70%. But again, ports and industry buildings do not have bonus income from slaves. You need to make up for that by having the slave populations. So let's talk about ports. Again, they don't give bonus income from slaves, but they do actually generate a small amount of slaves per turn now, which makes them highly desirable for Dark Elves. And like the industry buildings, it's reliant on having a good multiplier from your slave count. Now, what about control? Because by default, you do lose more slaves per turn if your control is poor. Good question. So that is now simulated by settlements consuming slaves. It goes from 1, 2, 4, 8, and 16. So the more developed it is, the more slaves you lose. But that's still not a very big deal. A single industry building by default costs you 60 slaves per turn. And here's a level 5 settlement only costing 16. Now, if your control is poor, it goes up plus 100% building slaves used, plus 300% slaves used, and plus 900% slaves used. Now keep in mind that even this right here, at the super low control, which you don't want to be at, that still is only costing 160 slaves per turn, which is barely more than 3 industry buildings, and that requires a level 5 city. The short version of this is that as long as you maintain decent control across your empire, it's not going to make a significant difference. In fact, you'll passively gain more slaves, most likely, than you will lose from that. However, if your control is horrible everywhere, then yes, it's going to be nearly impossible to keep up, just like the default game. So make sure you are maintaining reasonable control. The other big feature is dictats, which there's 3 of them here, and there's a couple significant things about them. First of all, they cost more, but their effects are bigger. So Slave Drive is 800 slaves, but it gives 100 growth and minus 20% construction cost, rather than being 400 for 50 and 10%. So it's basically twice as good for twice the cost. The open markets, instead of costing 600 slaves for 1,000 treasury, it's now 1,000 slaves for 300 treasury, so it's a little bit of a better ratio. And fights to the death, instead of 400 slaves for 20 control, it's 600 slaves for 30 control, so you can really lock down provinces with that at the cost of 600 slaves. The other important part here is that you can activate these in multiple provinces. So you could activate Slave Drive here in the Ancient City, and then you could activate it over here in the Ashen Coast as well. You can also have multiple dictats active in the same province. If you have a new province that's in bad control situation and you want to build it up, you could get a Slave Drive going and Fights to the Death going for both. But it will cost you 1,400 slaves, which, as you can see, would drain our entire slave count right now. So it's important to figure out how to ration the slaves and use them as dictats. If you never use dictats, you will have a worse result than unmodded. It is important and to be engaged with the dictat system. It offers more actual choice, it rewards planning, and I think it is a much better, more engaging, less frustrating implementation of that. It also means that you can't ever waste slaves to the same degree. By default, you can get to the point where it's I literally can't use slaves on anything, I'm just losing them. This does not feel great. With this system, you can always dump more slaves into something as needed to manage your slaves. So again, it should be a much more active and engaging protocol. So, obviously, because there is no more slave income from ports and industry buildings, we had to change some skills and techs. So, Choose or Die, for example, instead of being 3% income from slaves, it's just 3% income from all buildings, which is technically slightly better. But it's pretty close. I think it might be the percent better, maybe, let's say. And again, skills are related to the same thing as well. So, or faction effects, what is it? Crone Hellebrand, I believe, in Lokir gets 5% more income from slaves. Now it's 5% income from buildings. And of course, let's not forget the corruption, though in this case, instead of getting 15% income from slaves, it is now 10% income from all buildings for Morathi. Let's see. So we also have roads. We're given some tweaks. They no longer reduce dictat cost because we don't want to make it too easy to spam this open markets to generate an insane amount of gold. They also, by default, they give a 4% income to all cities in the province bonus income. That has been removed because it tends to really favor roads in 4 city provinces and makes them really bad in 1 or 2 city provinces. Now it just gives a flat amount of gold. Again, that will scale up the better your slave population is. Still gives 5 growth if it matters, 3% trade tariff, which can add up with a lot of roads, and the movement range was also bought from 15 to 30%, so it's actually more reasonable to have roads. So roads are helpful now if you don't have a better building to build in the 3rd slot. Farms still give an increase in slave capacity. They no longer give an increase to slave income, and they were never good for that really in the first place. Even a level 3 farm, well, with a level 3 industry building, only generated 60 gold effectively for 1 building. Build farms if you want growth and replenishment. Also, you may notice there's no longer a requirement to have slaves to get the full growth or replenishment or anything. It just applies to everything. It's just a flat amount. Then, I believe finally, we're looking at the slave pens. The level 2 version was buffed from 10 to 16 slaves per turn, so that's a little bit better. And that actually winds up being significant because of the percent decline. If you have assassins and black arcs and potentially corruption if you're Morathi and slave pens, you can make it so that you're generating more slaves passively than you lose from the percent income, and you can steady yourself to avoid having your entire empire collapse. It does require a lot of investment into that, but if you want a more stable Dark Elf regime, you can build that up with sufficient infrastructure investments. It won't be as good as the more volatile, focusing on sacking and raiding, but it will allow you to be more stable if you'd prefer a slower, more methodical gameplay, and that's less aggressive. So, I think that about covers it. Again, it is 20% slaves lost, which is, again, winds up being generally more helpful as time goes on, because it means that if things go wrong, it's easier to recover from it, and you don't get into a hole you can't dig yourself out of. It focuses on making the dictats useful, and it provides pretty roughly equivalent experiences in the playtesting that I've done, though of course feedback and tweaking is always in the cards. Finally, as mentioned a few times, there are links below showing the 2 Turn 30 Morathi camp playthroughs. One was done unmodded, the other was done modded. They both wound up in functionally the same place. The unmodded happened to be sieging a city that the unmodded was able to capture because the Sisters of Twilight took the same city, so it didn't have walls, so I was able to capture it earlier with that. But that's just some campaign differences that can come up. So if you want to see the play-by-play look at that, otherwise I hope you consider this. More engaging slave system, less punishing to new players, and engaging in active diktats. Thank you very much for watching. One final note that I forgot. The slave right cost is now 400 instead of 800. This is because when you're losing 20% of slaves per turn from the get-go, it is harder to build up to that 800 threshold. And testing it with the 800 was much harder to get the initial rights out when playing the modded version than unmodded. So it was brought back to its original value of 400 to keep the overall experience much more similar unmodded versus modded.